In a bustling high-end restaurant filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware, a young boy sat quietly in his wheelchair. Dressed neatly in a suit, he looked around in awe at the elegant chandeliers and well-dressed guests, his eyes filled with both excitement and nervousness. He was just a kid trying to enjoy a special night out, something that should have been a simple, joyful experience. But not everyone saw it that way. A waiter, tall and well-groomed in his crisp black uniform, approached the boys' table. Instead of a warm welcome, he let out a sigh, his expression shifting to one of clear disapproval. He leaned in, lowering his voice, but making sure it was loud enough for others to hear. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he asked, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. The boy's face fell. He had been excited for this dinner, but now, under the weight of the waiter's gaze, he felt small. His hands tightened around the arms of his wheelchair as he struggled to find the right words. The waiter, seeing the hesitation, chuckled softly and continued. "This restaurant has a certain standard. Maybe somewhere else would be more comfortable for you." A few nearby diners turned their heads, pretending not to listen but clearly aware of what was happening. Some whispered to each other, some looked away, and some just watched in silence. But in a corner of the restaurant, one man sat still, listening carefully. Anthony Hopkins, an actor known for his legendary roles and quiet yet powerful presence, had heard every word. At first, he simply observed, his sharp blue eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. He watched the boy's face, the way his excitement had faded into embarrassment. He saw the waiter's smug expression, the way he towered over the child, as if he didn't belong. Anthony Hopkins knew this wasn't just about dinner. It was about dignity, respect, and standing up for someone who couldn't always stand up for himself. He set down his glass, pushed his chair back, and slowly stood up. The room hadn't noticed him yet, but they would soon. Because what was about to happen next, no one would ever forget. Anthony Hopkins walked across the restaurant with quiet confidence, his polished shoes making barely a sound on the marble floor. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone was enough. As he approached, the waiter was still speaking, his tone dripping with condescension. "Look, kid, I'm just saying, this isn't the place for." The waiter stopped mid-sentence as he felt someone standing beside him. Slowly, he turned his head and found himself face to face with Anthony Hopkins. His smug expression faltered, replaced with uncertainty. Anthony glanced at the boy first, offering him a reassuring nod before shifting his gaze back to the waiter. There was no anger in his face, no dramatic outburst, just a steady, piercing look that carried more weight than words ever could. The waiter swallowed hard. For a few seconds, the restaurant was silent. Conversations had hushed, and all eyes were on them. The boy shifted uncomfortably in his wheelchair, feeling the weight of the moment. He didn't want trouble, he just wanted to eat his meal in peace. But now he was the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. The waiter let out a nervous laugh, trying to regain control. "Mr. Hopkins," he said, forcing a polite smile. I was just making sure the young man was comfortable." Anthony didn't blink. "Comfortable?" His voice was calm but firm. "Is that what you were doing?" The waiter hesitated. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone as well known as Anthony Hopkins. He glanced around, searching for support, but none of his colleagues stepped in. A few guests were whispering now, watching how this would unfold. The boy's hands tightened on his lap, his face still flushed from the humiliation. He had been ignored, spoken down to, and now put on display. He wasn't sure if this was going to make things better or worse. Anthony finally broke the silence, his voice gentle yet commanding. "What's your name, son?" The boy looked up, unsure if he should even answer. "Liam," he said softly. Anthony nodded. "Liam, do you know who I am?" Liam nodded hesitantly. "You're an actor." Anthony smiled slightly. "That's right. And do you know what I've learned in all my years of acting?" Liam shook his head. Anthony's smile faded, his expression turning serious. "That the way we treat people when no one is watching says more about us than any performance ever could." The waiter shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this moment was slipping out of his control. But Anthony wasn't finished yet. He turned back to Liam, his voice steady. "You belong here just as much as anyone else, Liam. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." Liam's eyes widened slightly. For the first time that evening, he felt seen. Truly seen. But as much as Anthony's words carried weight, the question remained. Would the waiter realize his mistake? Or would he try to defend his actions? The restaurant held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The waiter's face twitched slightly, his confidence unraveling. He looked around, as if hoping for someone to step in, to validate his actions, but the restaurant was silent. Even those who had initially turned away were now watching, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. He cleared his throat, forcing a stiff smile. "Mr. Hopkins," he started, his voice tight, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Anthony didn't move, didn't blink. His steady gaze was enough to make the waiter hesitate. "A misunderstanding?" Anthony repeated, his voice calm but deliberate. "Then help me understand." The waiter opened his mouth, but for the first time that night, he had no clever response. He had been so sure of himself moments ago, treating Liam like he didn't belong, assuming no one would challenge him. But now, under Anthony's quiet authority and the weight of the room's attention, he felt exposed. Liam, still gripping the arms of his wheelchair, glanced down at the polished floor. His mind raced. He had spent his whole life in situations like this, where people looked at him differently, spoke to him like he was fragile, or worse, ignored him completely. He had learned to brush it off, to pretend he didn't care. But this time was different. Someone was standing up for him. Across the restaurant, a couple whispered to each other. A businessman at the bar glanced over his shoulder, subtly shaking his head. A young woman, who had been enjoying her meal moments ago, now watched with quiet intensity. The tension in the air was thick, but no one dared to interfere. The waiter shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I wasn't trying to be rude," he said finally, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed him. "I just thought." He stopped himself, realizing there was no good way to finish that sentence. Anthony exhaled slowly, tilting his head. "You thought what?" He pressed, his tone still level but firm. Liam's heart pounded. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. The waiter hesitated again, then let out a small, nervous laugh. "I just assumed he'd be more comfortable somewhere, less formal." A quiet murmur swept through the room. A few guests exchanged looks, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Liam clenched his fists. It wasn't the first time he'd heard those words, but they still stung. Anthony let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the waiter's words settle in the air. Then, after a moment, he finally spoke. "Comfort isn't about where you put someone. It's about how you treat them." The waiter swallowed, his hands tightening behind his back. He started to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Liam felt something shift inside him. All his life, he had tried not to make a scene, to avoid being the center of attention. But now, as he sat in his wheelchair, surrounded by strangers, with Anthony Hopkins standing beside him, he realized something. He wasn't just a kid in a wheelchair. He was a person who deserved to be treated with dignity. Anthony glanced down at him, as if sensing his thoughts. "What do you think, Liam?" he asked gently. Liam hesitated. He wasn't used to people asking him what he thought, especially in situations like this. His voice was quiet but steady. "I think I just wanted to eat dinner," he said. Anthony nodded, his expression unreadable. Then turning back to the waiter, he simply said, "So why don't we let him?" The room waited. The air was thick with unspoken tension, but the question remained. Would the waiter back down, or would his pride get in the way? The waiter's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room pressing down on him, waiting for his next move. His authority had been challenged, his actions called into question, and by none other than Anthony Hopkins himself. A part of him wanted to dig in, to defend himself, to regain control of the situation. But something in Anthony's gaze held him back. It wasn't anger or hostility, just a quiet, unshakable certainty that made it impossible to argue. For a long moment, no one spoke. The restaurant remained eerily still, as if the very air was holding its breath. Liam sat frozen in his wheelchair, his fingers gripping the armrests. He had spent his whole life navigating moments like this, where people decided how they saw him before he even had a chance to speak. But never before had he seen someone challenge it so openly. His heart pounded. The waiter finally cleared his throat, forcing a stiff smile. "Of course," he said, his voice tight. "I'll get the menu." But before he could turn away, Anthony's voice cut through the air once more. "That's not enough." The waiter stopped, his body tensing. "Excuse me." Anthony took a slow step forward, his posture calm but unyielding. "This isn't just about a menu," he said. "It's about how you made this young man feel. You humiliated him. You tried to make him feel like he didn't belong." His voice was quiet, but each word carried an unmistakable weight. "And now you're only backing down because people are watching." The murmur in the restaurant grew louder. A few guests exchanged glances, while others nodded subtly in agreement. The young woman from earlier shifted in her seat, eyes locked on the scene. Even the bartender had stopped polishing glasses, watching with silent curiosity. The waiter's face flushed. "I didn't mean." He stopped himself again, realizing how weak the excuse sounded. Liam swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if this was making things better or worse. He had spent years letting moments like this pass, pretending not to notice, pretending it didn't hurt. But now, as Anthony stood beside him, refusing to let it go, a new feeling stirred inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he mattered. The tension in the air was suffocating. The waiter looked around, searching for an escape, a way to end this without admitting he had been wrong. But Anthony wasn't finished yet. "This is a moment you'll remember," Anthony continued, his voice steady. "Because it's the moment you have to decide what kind of person you are. Are you the man who stands by his mistake, or the man who does something about it?" The waiter's lips parted slightly, his breath unsteady. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something else, something that looked almost like fear. Liam's chest tightened. He wanted to believe that people could change, that this moment could mean something. But deep down, he wasn't sure. He had been let down too many times before. The entire restaurant was waiting. The moment stretched unbearably long. And then finally, the waiter took a breath. What he said next would change everything. The waiter exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening into a fist at his side. His pride was at war with the truth in Anthony's words, but before he could speak, a voice cut through the heavy silence. "Is there a problem here?" A tall man in a dark suit had appeared near the entrance of the restaurant. His posture was rigid, his presence commanding. The restaurant manager. He had been watching from a distance, assessing the situation. And now, finally, he had stepped in. His eyes flickered between the waiter, Anthony, and Liam, reading the room in an instant. The waiter turned to him quickly, seizing the opportunity. "No problem at all, sir," he said, his voice suddenly more controlled. "Just a misunderstanding." Anthony raised an eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling it?" Liam felt his stomach tighten. He knew this pattern. When people in power got involved, things often ended the same way. The problem got swept under the rug, apologies were mumbled, and nothing ever really changed. The manager's expression remained unreadable as he turned his gaze toward Liam. "Sir, I hope you're enjoying your evening. If there's anything we can do to make your experience more comfortable, please let us know." Liam hesitated. He could hear the politeness in the man's tone, but there was something else underneath it. A need to make this go away, to smooth things over without truly addressing what had just happened. Anthony, however, wasn't interested in letting things be brushed aside. He stepped forward slightly. "I don't think the question is whether Liam is comfortable now. I think the question is why he was made to feel uncomfortable in the first place." The manager's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained composed. "Mr. Hopkins, we value all of our guests. If something inappropriate was said, we sincerely apologize." His tone was measured, careful. "Rest assured, we will handle this internally." Liam knew what that meant. A quiet talk in the back, maybe a warning, and then everything would go back to normal. But before Anthony could respond, something unexpected happened. From a nearby table, a man in his 40s, dressed in an expensive suit, suddenly leaned forward. "Actually," he said, loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear, "I think we'd all like to know how exactly you plan on handling this." Murmurs spread across the room. Another voice spoke up. "Yeah, because if no one had said anything, this kid would have just been pushed out like he didn't belong." A woman shook her head. "This isn't just about an apology." The manager's expression flickered with unease. He had expected to deal with one or two complaints, not the entire restaurant turning against him. The waiter, who had been shrinking into himself, looked around in panic. Liam could hardly process what was happening. He wasn't used to this. People noticing, people speaking up. Usually, when something like this happened, it was just him, alone, trying to convince himself it didn't matter. Anthony glanced at Liam, a small but knowing look in his eyes. The manager cleared his throat, straightening his tie. "We assure you, our restaurant does not tolerate discrimination of any kind." Anthony tilted his head. "Then let's make sure that's true." The manager hesitated. The entire restaurant was waiting for what he would say next. But just as he opened his mouth, the waiter suddenly spoke, his voice shaky. He swallowed. "I wasn't thinking. I just assumed." He trailed off, looking at Liam for the first time, really looking at him. His face was no longer defensive, no longer trying to justify his actions. It was something else now, something almost like regret. But was it real? Liam wasn't sure. And as much as the room had turned in his favor, the night wasn't over yet. There was still one more decision left to be made. The room felt charged with tension. The waiter stood there, his mouth slightly open, struggling to find the right words. He glanced around, seeing the disapproving looks from the diners, the steady, expectant gaze of Anthony Hopkins, and finally Liam, still gripping the armrests of his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. Liam didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to believe that the waiter's regret was real, but another part knew how easily people changed their tune when they were under pressure. He had spent years swallowing his pride, letting moments like this pass, but now, with the whole restaurant watching, something felt different. Anthony took a slow step forward. "Regret is a good start," he said, his voice calm but firm. but what matters is what you do next. The waiter swallowed hard. His hands fidgeted at his sides before he finally exhaled. I shouldn't have treated you that way, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't right. Liam's heart pounded. It wasn't the grand apology people might have expected, but it was something. The sincerity in the waiter's voice caught him off guard. But before he could respond, the manager took a step forward, his tone smooth and controlled. "We appreciate the honesty," the manager said, giving the waiter a sharp glance before turning back to Liam. "And of course, your meal is on the house tonight. We sincerely hope you'll give us another chance." Liam's stomach twisted. There it was, the neatly wrapped solution. The quick fix. A free meal in exchange for forgetting everything that had just happened. Anthony let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. It's not about the food. His voice cut through the air like a blade. It's about dignity, respect, making sure no one else has to go through what Liam just did. The manager shifted uncomfortably, clearly eager to move past the situation. "Of course, we'll make sure this doesn't happen again." But before he could continue, Liam finally spoke. "How?" The single word hung in the air. The manager blinked, caught off guard. "How are you going to make sure?" Liam pressed. His voice was steady now, stronger than he expected. "Are you actually going to change something, or do you just want me to stop making a scene?" A hush fell over the restaurant. The manager hesitated, but before he could respond, the waiter suddenly turned to Liam. "I'd like to serve your table," he said, his voice quieter now. "If you'll let me." Liam's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected that. A part of him wanted to refuse, to walk away, to hold on to his anger. But another part of him, the part that had been ignored, dismissed, overlooked for so long, saw something in the waiter's face that felt real. Slowly, Liam nodded. The manager looked surprised, but Anthony simply smiled, stepping back as the tension in the air shifted. The waiter gave a small nod, then turned toward the kitchen to grab the menu. As Liam sat there, the restaurant buzzing around him once more, he realized something. Tonight hadn't just been about one person's mistake. It had been about being seen, about standing up, about refusing to be invisible. And as Anthony Hopkins took his seat beside him, giving him an approving nod, Liam knew that this moment, this fight, had been worth it. The restaurant gradually returned to normal, but something had shifted. Liam could feel it. It wasn't just about the way people were looking at him now. It was about the way he felt about himself. He had spoken up. He had been heard. And that, more than anything, made all the difference. The waiter returned a few moments later, a menu in hand, his movements more careful, more deliberate. He placed it in front of Liam without a word, then stepped back slightly, waiting. Liam glanced at Anthony, who gave him an encouraging nod. Slowly, he looked up at the waiter. "I'll have the pasta," Liam said simply. The waiter nodded. Good choice. There was no tension in his voice this time. No awkwardness. Just the kind of normal, everyday interaction Liam had always wanted. Anthony leaned back in his chair, watching with quiet satisfaction. He had seen many things in his life: fame, power, the way people treated each other when they thought no one was watching. But tonight had reminded him of something important. Real change doesn't come from grand speeches or dramatic gestures. It comes from moments like this. Small choices, someone deciding to do better. As the waiter disappeared into the kitchen, the restaurant manager approached again, his expression still slightly guarded. "Mr. Hopkins," he said carefully, "and Liam." He hesitated before addressing him by name. "I want to personally assure you that we will be implementing staff training to prevent situations like this from happening again." Liam studied him, searching for signs of empty words. But for once, he didn't hear just a rehearsed apology. There was an effort, however small, to make things right. Anthony nodded. That's a start. The manager gave a slight bow and left them to their meal. Liam exhaled, finally allowing himself to relax. The weight that had been pressing on his chest all night had lifted. He turned to Anthony, a hint of a smile on his lips. "Did you plan all of that?" Anthony chuckled. Life doesn't always follow a script, but sometimes it gives you the chance to write a better ending. Liam thought about that as he took his first bite of pasta. Maybe this wasn't just about tonight. Maybe this was the start of something bigger, not just for him, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. As the conversation flowed and the tension of the evening faded, Liam realized one thing. Tonight, he hadn't just been defended. He had stood up for himself. And that, more than anything, was what truly mattered.